The shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long, casting dark ribbons across the pale linen sheets, where Nollywood royalty now lay reduced to a fragile, whisper-thin shadow of his former self. At 66 years old, a time when a man should be reflecting on the glory of a legacy built over decades of legendary performances, Zack Orji was instead locked in an agonizing, silent war against an invisible executioner. The diagnosis had arrived not as a gentle warning, but as a sudden, brutal sentence: late-stage, terminal cancer. It was a relentless predator, aggressive and unforgiving, consuming his vitality from the inside out and placing his life on an absolute razor-thin edge. Every single breath was no longer a natural reflex. It was a grueling, agonizing victory, fought against a body that was rapidly turning into a battleground of unimaginable physical torment. Outside those quiet, antiseptic-scented walls, millions knew him as the undisputed titan of African cinema, a charismatic screen giant whose thunderous voice, commanding presence, and effortless charm had defined an entire era of storytelling. He was the hero who always found a way, the steadfast anchor of 1,000 cinematic storms. But inside this dim sanctuary of pain, the grand stage lights were gone, replaced by the rhythmic, cold blip of heart monitors and the heavy, suffocating weight of terminal decline. The cancer had invaded mercilessly, spreading its roots deep into his bones and organs, leaving the veteran actor trapped in a harrowing reality where every passing hour felt like a treacherous tightrope walk between life and the abyss. Sitting by his bedside, her fingers intertwined with his frail, trembling hand, was Ngozi Orji. She was not just his wife. She was his soul's keeper, the woman who had walked beside him through the glittering peaks and quiet valleys of a shared lifetime. Now, she was forced to bear witness to a tragedy no script could ever have prepared her for. Her heart was not merely breaking. It was being systematically shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces with every labored exhale he took. The pain he endured was radiating directly into her soul, an unbearable psychological cruelty that left her breathless with grief. To watch the man you love, the pillar of your world, the brave sanctuary of your life, writhe in the brutal clutches of late-stage agony is a unique kind of torture. Ngozi sat in the heavy, oppressive silence, watching the terrible rhythm of his suffering. She saw the subtle winces that betrayed the searing pain pulsing through his nerve endings, the beads of cold sweat forming on his brow, and the sheer, exhausting effort it took for him to simply open his eyes. The vibrant, majestic man who had once filled every room with his electric warmth was now fighting a frantic, desperate battle just to remain anchored to the physical world. Her tear-streaked face reflected a profound, shattering helplessness. No amount of love, no devotion, and no prayer could absorb the physical agony tearing through her husband's body. The tragic turn had not begun with a grand dramatic gesture, but with subtle, almost imperceptible whispers of fate that no one had truly anticipated. It was a normal morning when the first fracture in their world appeared, a sudden, terrifying collapse that shattered the illusion of health and stability in a single, heart-stopping second. Before the frantic emergency calls, before the flashing sirens, and before the solemn-faced doctors delivered the devastating verdict in quiet, clinical tones, there had only been the quiet routine of two lives deeply interwoven. But the moment the diagnosis of advanced, life-threatening malignancy was rendered, the timeline of their lives split irrevocably into two distinct eras: the world before the diagnosis and the desperate, agonizing nightmare after it. As the days blurred together into a continuous nightmare of medical interventions and harrowing updates, the atmosphere around the couple grew increasingly charged with a tense, atmospheric dread. News of the icon's precarious state began to ripple outward, moving like a dark wave through the industry and into the homes of millions who adored him. Whispers filled the corridors, and a profound collective anxiety took hold. How could a man so full of life, so seemingly invincible, be brought to the absolute precipice of existence in the span of a few cruel months? Every creak of the hospital door, every sudden shift in the monitor's steady rhythm sent a jolt of pure terror through Ngozi's chest. The agony of late-stage cancer is not merely physical. It is an omnipresent thief that steals peace, hope, and dignity, leaving behind a raw, nerve-exposed reality. Ngozi stared at Zack's face, tracing the familiar lines of his jawline, now sharp and hollowed by the relentless disease. She leaned in closer, listening to the agonizingly faint sound of his breathing, conscious that every second carried the terrifying weight of a final farewell. The sheer speed of the destruction was hypnotic in its horror, drawing everyone involved deeper into a dark, uncertain vortex where the line between holding on and slipping away grew dangerously thin. The faint, persistent odor of antiseptic couldn't fully drown out the unmistakable scent of old leather and mild peppermint, a signature mix that had belonged to Zack Orji for as long as Ngozi could remember. It lingered in the heavy air of the room, a ghost of the man who used to stride into a room and instantly command its temperature. Ngozi reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she gently pressed her thumbs into the palm of his right hand. It was an actor's hand, lined with character, once capable of broad, expressive gestures that captivated millions across screens big and small. Now the skin was dry, translucent like parchment, revealing a delicate webbing of blue veins that pulsed with a slow, laborious rhythm. Every line on his knuckles seemed to tell the story of a lifetime, but today, those same fingers barely had the strength to curl around hers. When his hand twitched, a tiny reflex response to a sharp spike of internal agony, Ngozi felt the vibration travel straight up her arm and settle like lead in her chest. "Zack," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the IV pump. She leaned down so close that the soft fabric of her headscarf brushed against his hollow cheek. Up close, the brutal reality of late-stage cancer was written in agonizing detail. His skin, once radiant and deep, had taken on a dull, sallow undertone. The deep-set laugh lines around his eyes, which used to crinkle warmth into every conversation, were now drawn tight, strained by the relentless friction of physical pain. Even in his restless twilight sleep, his brow remained furrowed in a permanent knot of resistance. He shifted, a low, guttural murmur catching in his throat. His eyelids fluttered, heavy and swollen, fighting against the heavy sedatives flowing into his veins. For a brief, suspended second, his dark eyes met hers. They weren't the sharp, fiery eyes of the Nollywood giant the world knew. They were wide, glossy with unshed tears, and filled with a raw, primal vulnerability that broke Ngozi's heart into 1,000 pieces. In that quiet glance, there was no pretense, no acting, no script, only a man staring down the terrifying, pain-racked frontier of his own mortality, looking to his wife as his last remaining tether to the earth. Ngozi pressed her forehead against his cool knuckles, closing her eyes tightly to force back the burn of fresh tears. She remembered the precise cadence of his voice, that deep, resonant baritone that could fill a room without a microphone. Now, the only sound he could offer was a shallow, raspy intake of air, followed by a faint exhale that felt entirely too fragile for a man who had once seemed larger than life. She adjusted the heavy blanket over his shoulders, her fingers lingering on the sharp angle of his collarbone. He had lost so much weight that his expensive wedding band, which had nestled securely on his ring finger for decades, now sat loosely, threatening to slide off at the slightest movement. Ngozi gently nudged the band back up to the knuckle, a small, desperate act of preservation. She remembered the day he had placed a matching band on her finger, the warmth of his hands, the overwhelming promise of forever. Watching that same band hang loose on his wasted frame was a quiet, suffocating agony. On the small bedside table sat a half-empty plastic cup of water with a bent straw, a small tub of petroleum jelly for his dry lips, and a framed, dusty 4x6 photograph they had brought from home. In the picture, taken just 2 years prior at a family gathering, Zack was standing under the bright Nigerian sun, laughing effortlessly, his arm draped securely around Ngozi's shoulders. The stark contrast between the vibrant man in the frame and the frail body stretched across the white hospital sheet was an unbearable sight. A sharp, high-pitched chime suddenly broke from the heart rate monitor mounted above his head, its digital numbers spiking erratically. Zack's breath caught in a jagged, painful gasp, his chest rising abruptly as a fresh wave of agony shot through his nervous system. His small, helpless groan reverberated through the quiet room, a sound so thick with suffering that Ngozi reflexively drew back, her hands hovering over him, terrified to touch him, yet terrified to let go. She squeezed his hand tighter, willing her own strength to flow through their locked fingers, desperate to absorb even a fraction of the pain that was tearing him apart from within. Outside the window, the distant hum of city traffic continued indifferently. But inside this small, dim room, time had compressed into an agonizing count of breaths, each one a fierce, exhausting battle against the encroaching dark. The machine continued its steady metallic rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. A sterile heartbeat that belonged more to the hospital room than to the broken man resting on the bed. Yet the air in the room remained strangely heavy, thick with the unsaid and the impossible. Ngozi stood frozen, her eyes staring at the faint, angry red indentation burned into Zack's palm. It wasn't a scar, nor was it a simple crease of skin. It looked almost fresh, as though the brass key depicted on that vanished parchment had been pressed firmly against his flesh only moments ago. Her mind reeled, tumbling over the razor-thin line between sanity and exhaustion. Was it a dream? An hallucination born of days without sleep and a heart hollowed out by grief? But the faint scent of sandalwood still clung to the collar of her sweater, persistent and alien against the chemical-sharp smell of the ICU. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she gently traced the edge of the key-shaped mark on Zack's palm. The moment her skin brushed his, a tiny, subtle shift occurred in the digital readout beside the bed. The steady line of his brain activity flickered with a sudden, sharp spike. His eyelids didn't open, but beneath the thin, translucent skin, his eyes darted rapidly back and forth in a frantic, silent distress signal. "Zack," she whispered, her voice a ragged breath. No answer came from his lips, which remained slack around the clear plastic of the oxygen mask. Yet, his left hand, the one resting near his side, slowly, deliberately closed into a tight fist, not in pain, but in a gesture of guarding something. Ngozi looked down toward the foot of the bed, where his personal belongings sat in a small, clear plastic bag provided by the staff upon his emergency admission. Inside was his watch, his ring, his wallet, and the worn leather pouch he had carried on every film set for the past 20 years. The bag was sealed with blue medical tape. Or at least it had been. She stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. The blue tape at the top of the bag had been neatly sliced down the middle, a clean, precise cut. Bending down, she reached into the bag. Her hand instinctively sought the inner compartment of the leather pouch. Her fingertips brushed past familiar items, old receipts, a faded plastic rosary, a small vial of anointed oil, until they made contact with something else. Something cold, something smooth and metallic, wrapped tightly in a thick piece of dark blue silk. She pulled her hand back as if burned, casting a quick, terrified glance toward the hallway. Through the small glass window in the door, the corridor was completely empty. The nurse's station was quiet, bathed in the dim fluorescent glow of the graveyard shift. The hospital was asleep, yet the atmosphere in room 408 felt as volatile as a thunderstorm waiting to break. Her fingers slid the small silk bundle out of the bag. As the fabric unraveled in her trembling hand, she didn't find a key. Instead, she unfolded a heavy silver medallion, tarnished at the edges, stamped with the exact same symbol that had been sealed in red wax on the brown envelope. A serpent eating its own tail, encircling a six-pointed star. But on the reverse side of the medallion, 3 letters were deeply engraved, followed by a set of numbers that meant nothing to her. MOV 0419. Ngozi stared at the numbers. April 19th. That was the exact date 6 months ago when Zack had returned from his unannounced 3-week trip to the remote border region, a trip he had brushed off as an exploratory location scout for a historical drama that was never produced. He had come back from that journey noticeably quieter, paler, complaining for the first time in his life of a deep, bone-weary fatigue that no amount of rest could cure. A soft, raspy sound broke the silence. Ngozi spun around. Zack's head had turned slightly on the pillow. His eyes were half open now, clouded by the heavy haze of sedatives and failing organs. But his gaze was fixed intently, not on her face, but on the silver medallion resting in her open hand. A single clear tear leaked from the corner of his left eye, tracing a slow path down his sunken cheek. He didn't speak, but his lower lip trembled, forming the silent shape of a single word, repeated over and over without sound. "Burn, burn, burn." Before she could process his silent plea, the heavy double doors at the far end of the ICU hallway swung open with a dull thud. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor, approaching room 408 with unhurried authority. Ngozi quickly shoved the medallion deep into her coat pocket, her heart pounding in her throat as she stepped back toward Zack's bed. She looked at the door, waiting for the shadow to cross the window, unsure whether she was praying for a doctor to enter, or terrified of who might actually walk through that door. The heavy footsteps paused just outside the door. Through the frosted glass panel, a tall, distorted silhouette blocked the pale light of the corridor, motionless, as if listening to the quiet beep of the heart monitor inside. Ngozi held her breath, her hand buried deep in her coat pocket, her fingers clenched so tightly around the cool silver medallion that its sharp edges bit painfully into her skin. The metallic scent of blood and the heavy fragrance of sandalwood seemed to thicken, hanging suspended in the cold air of the room like an unanswered question. The brass handle of the door began to turn, slowly, agonizingly, millimeter by millimeter. Ngozi took a step back, her heels catching on the frame of Zack's bed. She looked down at her husband. His eyes were wide, staring fixedly at the opening door, filled not with the panic of a dying man, but with a hollow, resigned terror. His pale lips parted again, forming that same soundless, desperate instruction over and over. Burn, burn, burn. The door swung inward with a faint hiss of displaced air. It was not the dark-coated stranger from the night. Standing in the threshold was Dr. Adebayo, the chief oncologist, holding a thick manila folder under his arm. He looked exhausted, his wire-rimmed glasses resting low on the bridge of his nose, his eyes carrying the familiar, somber weight of a physician preparing to deliver bad news. "Mrs. Orji?" the doctor murmured softly, stepping into the room. He glanced around, his brows knitting together slightly, as if sensing the lingering tension in the air. "I'm sorry to disturb you at this hour. We just received the results from the specialized tissue biopsy we sent to the central lab on Tuesday." Ngozi swallowed hard, trying to force her voice through a throat that felt scraped raw. And Dr. Adebayo opened the file, his eyes scanning the dense lines of medical text. He sighed, a sound heavy with frustration and genuine bewilderment. "Mrs. Orji, in my 30 years of practicing medicine, I have never seen a progression quite like this. The rapid cell degradation we witnessed over the last 3 weeks, it matches no known classification of late-stage aggressive carcinoma." He paused, adjusting his glasses, looking up from the paper to meet her eyes. "What do you mean?" Ngozi asked, her voice trembling. "You told us it was terminal cancer. The scans showed mass tissue failure, yes," Dr. Adebayo interrupted gently, but his tone carried an unsettling note of hesitation. "However, the molecular analysis came back an hour ago. There are no malignant cells, Mrs. Orji. None. His organs are failing, his bone marrow is deteriorating at a catastrophic rate, but it is not cancer. Biochemically, it is as if his cellular structure is simply being drained of its ability to hold itself together. It's like his body is reacting to a severe unknown toxin or an extreme biological shock. The words hung in the sterile room, absurd and chilling. Ngozi's hand tightened further around the medallion in her pocket. Not cancer. All those weeks of agony, the crushing diagnoses, the whispered condolences, the televised prayers across Nollywood for a dying legend, all built upon a lie, or at least a profound medical ignorance. "Then, what is happening to him?" she whispered, staring at the doctor. Dr. Adebayo closed the folder with a quiet thud. "We don't know. We want to run a toxicology panel immediately, but we need your consent to transfer him to the isolated research wing." He looked past her toward the bed, his expression darkening. "And Mrs. Orji, there's one more thing." He stepped closer to the bedside table, pointing at the small plastic cup of water near the dusty 4R6 photograph. When the night nurse came in at midnight to adjust his IV, she noted something strange in his room log. "Did anyone come in to visit him between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m.? Ngozi felt a sudden spike of cold dread run down her spine. "No. Why?" "Because the security footage from the hallway monitor outside room 408 shows the door opening and closing at precisely 3:05 a.m., Dr. Adebayo said slowly, his eyes searching her face. "But there is no one on the tape entering or leaving the room, just the door, moving on its own." The quiet hum of the IV machine seemed to grow louder, filling the silence between them. Ngozi didn't answer. She couldn't. On the bed, Zack's breathing suddenly shifted, the harsh, labored gasps smoothing out into a deep, rhythmic rise and fall. The red indicator light on the monitor stopped flashing its warning codes, settling into a calm, steady green. The terrifying agony that had racked his frame for days seemed to recede all at once, leaving his face smooth, peaceful, and entirely unreadable. He looked as though he were merely asleep, a legendary actor resting between takes. But his right hand remained resting open on the white sheet, the red, branded outline of the ancient brass key still faintly visible beneath his skin, slowly fading under the harsh fluorescent lights like drying ink. Dr. Adebayo waited for a moment, waiting for her response, but when none came, he gave a quiet, respectful nod and stepped back toward the door. "Think about the transfer, Mrs. Orji. We need answers before it's too late." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Ngozi alone once more with her husband. She slowly withdrew her hand from her coat pocket and looked down at the silver medallion in her palm. The engraved letters and numbers, MOV 0419, seemed to gleam under the hospital lights. Outside the window, the first faint gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon of the city, dissolving the night's shadows, yet throwing everything inside the room into an even deeper, more agonizing obscurity.